The armed forces of Ukraine carried out a series of precision strikes on military and energy facilities.
It's too late to work. The sea will recede towards us. Top story: a strike by naval drones on the port and pier. A Russian warship was blown up near Novorossiysk. There is a fire at a petrochemical plant in Kazan. In Voronezh, 3 missile strikes hit CHP-1. Part of the city is without power. In Crimea, there was a detonation at an oil depot in Gvardeyskoye, a series of large-scale strikes on Russian territory. An energy crisis, collapse, and blackouts are hitting Russia's war economy, which is falling apart. New sanctions against Russia, the fall of Lukoil, and also an upcoming special operation by Trump in Venezuela to overthrow the Maduro regime. And how this will affect oil prices, we'll discuss with top economist Igor Lipsits right now.
Over the past 12 days, we've attacked almost 20 thermal power plants. The first blackout happened in the Moscow region, and yesterday there were blackouts in Voronezh and Belgorod. In general, how do blackouts affect the lives of Russians?
Well, there are basically 2 lines of impact here. The first line is the impact on people's mood. We were interested to find that, generally speaking, the mood is changing. And this is evident even in the official sociological data, which, always tries to paint a prettier picture, but you can't cover everything up. Otherwise, it just wouldn't look good. So even they admit that Russians are starting to get very tired of the war, and the number of those who support it unconditionally has dropped quite a lot, while the number of people who are tired of the war has exceeded 40%. Sometimes the numbers are even more significant. So, that initial attitude, like it's happening somewhere else, it doesn't concern us, that attitude is starting to fade because people are beginning to feel that the war is having an impact. Prices are rising, more and more money is being taken away, and the overall negative situation in the economy is affecting everything. So a kind of fatigue is building up, and the more blows like this, ones that have a widespread impact and lower the quality of life, the less people will feel that this is just some war happening abroad that doesn't concern us, and the more they will feel that it's time to somehow bring this problem to a close. Well, that's the first effect. The second effect is, of course, economic, because shutting down the power grid doesn't just cause difficulties in the residential and personal sectors. It also means factories stop working, it creates problems in generating income, it leads to a reduction in overall profits, and as a result, a decline in the tax base. The tax base and Russia's financial situation is already so bad that, notice, Russia has adopted already in the first reading, the budget for next year hasn't even been fully adopted yet, and they've already had to urgently revise it. And not by a small amount, about 7 trillion, because they made the budget as war-oriented as possible, severely cutting the civilian sector. This sparked a huge outcry within their own government circles, so they had to urgently start reallocating some funds to quiet the uproar. In other words, the situation is such that the financial losses are already so great that even the state is no longer fully in control of the financial situation. So all of this keeps piling up and piling up. Debts are growing, the budget deficit is increasing, the national debt is rising. By the way, that's something Russians usually don't even think about. It's a concept that's not very clear to them. But in reality, these are all issues that will continue to affect the lives of Russians for a long time to come. So all these kinds of damages inflicted on the energy system are a painful issue. It's not fatal yet, but it is painful, because in general it undermines the stability of Russian life, which Putin clings to so much.
Igor Vladimirovich, what is happening with Russia's energy sector, especially in the context of strikes on refineries and ports, because we attacked Ust-Luga and now Tuapse? They write that the attack by naval drones on the port in Tuapse has practically halted its operations. The situation is complicated. Moreover, we see that it is suffering. Mongolia is suffering greatly because it used to import petroleum products from the Russian Federation, and now Russia is forced to import petroleum products from Belarus and China. How painful is this for the Russian economy right now?
Well, it is painful because there was a sense that Russia was generally protected from Ukrainian attacks since it's far away and the vast territory is far from Ukraine. Trouble wouldn't reach there. There are oil refineries in Siberia, and in general, products can be transported. There are pipelines. Overall, there was this feeling, how should I put it, of a huge, stable economy that no one could harm. It turned out that this was an illusion, that in modern warfare, damage can be inflicted even without heavy missile attacks. And now we're witnessing this rather unpleasant situation where, how should I put it, there's a kind of psychological pressure from local authorities on enterprise leaders demanding that all major Russian companies set up their own air defense systems around their facilities at their own expense, no less. So, in effect, a dual air defense system is emerging, one state run and one private. It's a rather unusual situation, but of course, it's a strange one because, first of all, where would you even get that many air defense systems? To cover all major Russian enterprises, there simply isn't that much military equipment in existence. Then again, these are additional expenses which companies will naturally pass on to the prices of their products. So these are, in a way, rather painful situations, but I do understand the local authorities' leaders. You have to realize that when drone attacks hit enterprises, it's not just a local industrial accident at that particular facility. Many of these enterprises contain, well, how should I put it, hazardous substances. And in the event of fires or such accidents, these substances can be released into the air. And that's why there are threats of chemical exposure to the surrounding settlement. Because of drone attacks on certain industrial facilities, this isn't chemical warfare, but the consequences could be very similar. For example, chlorine releases into the air. You can look it up in civil defense textbooks. Some of these incidents cause unpleasant consequences, and so on. So, in this sense, there is no way for the army to protect every facility on Russian territory without exception. It's simply impossible, and Russia has really found itself in a situation that military analysts have accurately described. For the first time, the sheer size of Russia's territory has become a weak point in its military system, whereas before it was a strength. When the fighting was done by infantry, the vastness was an advantage. It took a long time for anyone to get anywhere, to transport anything. It was all terribly slow. But drone warfare has changed the situation. For the first time, the enormous territory with so many technological sites, which can't all be protected, has become a problem for Russia, because now they have to choose whether to use their air defense systems to protect the army, the capital, or industrial facility. In other words, Russia has found itself in a war it did not expect, was not prepared for, and in this war it is suffering losses which will have long-term consequences. Well, look at what we're seeing, for example, in the oil sector. A truly dire situation has arisen because there is now a shortage of motor fuel within Russia itself. And Russia has intergovernmental agreements to supply motor fuel to both Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan. And because of the shortage in Russia, these two countries were left without fuel. In other words, happy indeed. Everyone there was fine, everything was going well for them. But now there's no happiness because there's nothing to fill up with. And Russia, despite having a shortage on its own territory, started sending fuel there. Well, because it's an intergovernmental agreement, at the same time, look at this situation. Formally, there is a ban on the export of motor fuel in Russia. That is, exporting is not allowed. But apparently, under intergovernmental agreements, it is allowed. So, on the one hand, it's prohibited, but on the other hand, they're exporting anyway. Well, because, I mean, what are Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan supposed to just die because of Russia's war? So they sent tankers, sent trains with fuel there. But this only makes the shortage in Russia worse. So it's pretty hard to say what will happen, but it's difficult to fix this quickly. There's no equipment, and besides, these are additional costs anyway, which again will be added to the cost of producing gasoline and diesel fuel, and as a result will push prices up. So there are a lot of unpleasant situations here. Moreover, since Russian oil companies can't send oil to refineries, they've started exporting more crude oil instead. And accordingly, the scale of production in Russia will simply be reduced for a long time. So accordingly, the consequences of the fuel shortage will last for a long time. Whether it will be possible to overcome them is hard to say. Most likely no. So overall, it's quite an unpleasant situation. And you know, Russia simply can't live without fuel. The country is huge. Besides, if you know, there are places in Russia called the far north. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but in the far north, they never turn off a car engine for the winter. That is, it runs around the clock because if it freezes, you won't be able to thaw it out until spring. That's why fuel reserves have to be very large. And if there are any disruptions, it poses a threat to people's very survival in the northern regions of Russia, as they say. So overall, the consequences are quite unpleasant and difficult to resolve. That's what's happening with this market.
Igor Vladimirovich, you've always said that the time would come when Russians would be heating with wood stoves. Has that time come now when we see that winter is coming? Well, what's your opinion?
Well, so far, Russians still treat my predictions with skepticism. Although a woman from Vladivostok wrote to me recently saying, "We thought about it. My husband actually agreed with you. And you won't believe it, Dasha. We moved into an old house, a house built a long time ago, and it has chimneys in the walls. We tapped on them, found them. So if anything happens, we know where to hook up a wood stove." But of course, people in big houses in Moscow, they have a hard time believing in such an idea. But in reality, you know, anything is possible. A blackout would create a huge problem. Because in Moscow, if something happens, there won't even be anywhere to gather people, you see. Well, usually in such situations, people are gathered in some kind of sports facilities and heat generators are set up there. But in Moscow, there are so many people that you can't hide everyone in stadiums, and there are no alternative systems. And if there are also strikes on the power grid, then, as they say, you won't even be able to turn on an electric heater. And then, in many cases, there will simply be, as they say, an instant burnout of all electrical systems. Well, how can I put it? You have to understand that there are a lot of old cities in Russia. And in old cities, there are old utility systems. I remember I once read something and found it terribly amusing. Well, amusing from an economist point of view, but for ordinary people, it's not so funny that in the city of St. Petersburg, there is an energy police. It's hard to grasp, but the thing is, the city is old, the utility infrastructure is very old, and the cable systems are weak. While people who have started living well off lives in St. Petersburg began to beautify their homes, and beautifying one's home always means an increase in electricity consumption. It is one of the most important indicators of quality of life. So people started installing heated floors and air conditioning systems. Some energy debauchees even put a sauna in their apartment, and this leads to such an increase in load that, as you can imagine, the fuses in your apartment blow first. You install special fuses, then the fuses on the stairwell blow, so you put in a bypass, but then the whole neighborhood goes out. So the energy police of St. Petersburg catch those who consume too much, those who demand too much, and they deal with them. Moreover, Russia has now introduced a tiered system of paying for electricity to force people to consume less energy. Now, higher rates are going to be introduced, and apparently the minimum threshold for electricity consumption will be significantly reduced so that people don't use too much electricity. In other words, they're really going to hit people in the wallet for living comfortably so they won't live so happily. So, in this sense, the situation of losing a comfortable way of life is developing in Russia, and it's quite difficult to stop this process. It will only intensify.
Igor Vladimirovich, one of the most interesting topics is social protests. Here's what we're seeing: a nationalist march. A march of Russian nationalists recently took place in the Moscow region. Everyone was discussing it very actively. What do you associate this with? Are these certain protests against someone, and how much can they influence the situation of turbulence in Russia?
Well, this always creates a very complicated situation. In general, this Russian question is always quite explosive in Russia because, well, these nationalists always hit a sensitive nerve in the Russian Federation. They say that in Russia, for example, there are national entities, Tatar, Bashkir, but there is no Russian one. That is, there isn't a single Russian republic. In the Russian Federation, there is no Russian republic, meaning Russians don't have their own state. This is a constant topic that we are being discriminated against here, even though we are the nation that forms the state. It discriminates against us, doesn't take us into account. And this is a constant topic. Sometimes it flares up, sometimes it dies down. During times of crisis, it intensifies because people try to find, how should I put it, some kind of support for their self respect. There is no other support, only national identity can provide it. And now we are seeing this surge again. It happens periodically. I've experienced this many times in my life. In the 1990s, for example, this kind of thing really surged. Society, those who remember, maybe the older generation, remembers how it used to fight with us, with the Jews shouting at us back then, suitcase, train station, Israel, and in the end they shouted at me too. Well, that's a story that's easy to understand, but it's a recurring theme that never goes away. And now what's happening? This whole war and all the hysteria around the war stirred up by Putin, all this search for enemies, it's basically an encouragement of the darkest forces in society, and that's where this powerful movement comes from. It was the same in the Russian Empire. If you remember the Black Hundreds, which existed under the leadership of the Tsar's people, all of this happened a long time ago and it has always existed in Russia. But sometimes it's suppressed because it's very dangerous for Russia, where many nationalities live. And sometimes the state simply doesn't have the strength to suppress it anymore. And then this dark theme in Russian life, the dark forces, the dark part of society gains confidence in itself and becomes more active. Right now, Russia is going through exactly such a period when this dark force in society is becoming more active. And
What do you think about the migrant protests? We saw in New Moscow there was a whole brawl using improvised objects, bats, pipes. After that, the FSB, together with the National Guard, organized joint raids against migrants. Igor Vladimirovich, this anti migrant policy of central Moscow, how much could it also lead to some kind of turbulence, even from all economic and social points of view?
this is a very complicated issue. The thing is, Russia, it has found itself in a certain predicament connected to the fact that the country is experiencing a process of depopulation. It's a rather difficult, even frightening process. Interestingly, when I mention the numbers for Russia's future depopulation, an incredible number of people get outraged. They criticize my words harshly because I say things that sound frightening. But I was pleased to notice that the well-known Russian demographer Alexei Raksha fully quotes. He gives the same numbers as I do, makes the same assessments, and they are quite alarming. These assessments indicate that in the next 70 years, that is, by the end of this century, Russia's population will be reduced by half. This, of course, creates a major problem. After all, Russia's vast economy was designed for a different population size. The population is declining, there aren't enough people to work, and the question arises, what should be done? That's why, of course, there's hysteria. Let's have more children. But somehow this isn't really working out. Despite all the appeals and even incentives, the birth rate in Russia isn't increasing. It remains low and is even declining. Again, demographers say that Russia hasn't had such a low birth rate in 15 years, if not more. So basically, we're rolling back very far. In this sense, it's a big problem, so some kind of workforce is needed to maintain the level of economic activity that has been established. That means migrants need to be brought in, but here is where things also start to, how should I put it? There's discord within the authorities of the Russian Federation. Some of these authorities are shouting that migrants need to be brought in, otherwise we won't survive, we won't be able to work. And there will be no one to work on construction sites. And they're organizing the mass import of people from India and I think even from Nigeria. They want to bring them in. It's a very interesting topic. In the context of Russian racism, it's quite an interesting topic. And on the other hand, there's some other faction which is even led, among others, by the Russian Orthodox Church, which insists on no migrants at all. Migrants, they say, erode the identity of the Russian people, lead to the widespread adoption of other religions, which threatens the position of the ROC. So no migrants, deport everyone, deny everyone the opportunity. The Russian government is trying to balance between them. Right now, it has taken a kind of compromise position. Let them come, but without families, without children. So you come for a work shift, do your job, and then get out of here. It wasn't like this before. People used to stay in Russia, gradually bringing over their children, their wives, and then they would start taking citizenship. It kind of slightly compensated for the decline in the main population, but now that won't happen, which means the process of depopulation in Russia will only accelerate. So that's the situation. In other words, it's hard without migrants, but people don't want migrants. How this will be resolved is completely unclear.
Igor Vladimirovich, can we already say how serious the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil are? We saw that Timchenko wanted to acquire these foreign subsidiaries, but they didn't let him.
Not
Timchenko. Not Timchenko. Tell.
No, not Timchenko. The whole intrigue there was that formally it was not Timchenko. That is, the Gunvar company was indeed created together with Timchenko, but Timchenko understood that he would be subject to sanctions, and he urgently sold his shares, so to speak, just a few days before the occupation of Crimea. In other words, he was warned, and as they say, he formally withdrew so as not to fall under sanctions and not lose anything. So he formally withdrew. From the Gunver company, formally he is no longer there, but that's just on paper. In reality, whether that's true or not, we don't know. There is always what we can call a hidden owner, a masked proprietor. This is common in the business world. Lawyers know how to create such structures, so it's impossible to say for sure whether Timchenko is there or not. Officially, he isn't. So there was hope that Gunver could make the purchase and no one would say anything, but as you can see, it didn't work out. They didn't allow it. And now, of course, Lukoil is facing a major problem. I mean, Lukoil and Timchenko are worlds apart, but now, as they say, Lukoil is paying the price for Timchenko. They will have to sell off these assets piecemeal and at a significant loss. And, well, how should I put it? This now poses a threat to the very existence of Lukoil as a company. Because these foreign assets that have come under sanctions, as far as we can tell, accounted for almost 30% of the company's revenue. Losing 30% of any share of ownership, assets, or revenue is a huge problem for a large company. By the way, Lukoil was already not in a very good financial position. Over the past year, their profits have dropped sharply, just like the rest of the Russian oil industry. And now, with the loss of these assets, this income, and the profits from foreign assets, it could be a situation where Lukoil might end up bankrupt. Those are strong words. I don't know if it will happen or not, but the threat is real. That's why, as far as I've heard, there are now rumors going around in Moscow that it's over for Lukoil. After all, this is the second largest oil company, and any problems within this company will painfully affect the entire Russian oil industry and all the revenues the Russian budget receives from oil. Right now, there's a dramatic intrigue unfolding, and we're watching it with interest.
Igor Vladimirovich, do you feel that China and India are ready to stop buying Russian oil because of the sanctions? Trump, or is the situation still just as discouraging?
I can't feel it, but I can allow for the possibility. I can allow for it because, in the global economic arena, everyone looks out for their own interests first. That's just the way it is. And as far as we can tell, neither India nor China feels any particular friendship toward Russia, so to speak. They have no particular reason to buy from Russia for themselves. They bought because it was profitable. I've come across calculations showing that India benefited and saved about 15 to 17 billion dollars on cheap Russian oil. That's serious money. Because there were big discounts, price cuts on Russian oil. India made very good money on this. They bought cheap oil at a discount compared to other suppliers. They produced petroleum products. And then, instead of Russia, they sold these products to Europe. Again, they made good money from it. So it's clear why they were happy to buy and significantly increase their purchase volumes. Before the war, they didn't buy nearly as much. But during the war, they absolutely fell in love with Russia, or more precisely, with its cheap oil, with a passionate and tender affection. But now, of course, if they're offered an alternative, they'll turn away from Russia. And they are being offered an alternative. First of all, Iran is very eager to supply them. Iran is strongly urging the Americans to lift at least some of the sanctions on its oil exports so that it can supply oil to India and China and replace Russia. In other words, it's a classic case of let's make a deal. It's good for you. It's good for me. I'm ready to help you put pressure on Russia. And the second blow that Russia might face is coming from Saudi Arabia, which the Russian press has long liked to portray as a gentle friend, a gentle oil friend. This so-called oil girlfriend of the Russian Federation turned out to be nothing of the sort. This oil girlfriend, Saudi Arabia, announced that it is fully prepared to bring its reserve production capacities back online and completely replace Russian oil supplies to India and China. They have spare capacity. In this sense, Russia's position in the Indian and Chinese markets is not without alternatives. I'll put it this way, carefully. There are other suppliers. And in general, it's possible that Russia will lose these markets. For Russia, this is already a major problem. There are already reports coming in that there is a great deal of panic in Russia. This is due to the possible reduction of oil supplies to India, because everything will go to hell. Pardon the non-economic expression, the entire financial structure of the Russian state. In that case, they'll have to take emergency measures, drastically cut social programs, and it's not even clear what could possibly be cut. In other words, it's a very serious problem, and they'll have to carry out a major devaluation of the ruble just to print empty rubles to finance the state budget. So the threat to Russia is such that even if only India cuts its purchases by half, it would already be practically a financial catastrophe with no clear solution in sight.
Igor Vladimirovich, what is your opinion regarding Venezuela? Will Trump be able to change the regime? Is it possible that Maduro will flee to Moscow? And what will we have here in Moscow then? Yanukovych, Assad, Maduro, everyone who can, all equal, like on a snowboard. With them, Putin will protect.
Yeah, tell me about it.
So, hypothetically speaking, do you really think that Venezuela could change its leadership, that the regime could fall, and then it could restore relations with America and the oil market, and the situation with oil would change dramatically?
Well, anything is possible. As far as I understand, right now, American lawyers are looking for at least some kind of, how should I put it, legal justification for aggression against Venezuela. But as we know, with Trump, these things happen quite easily. So I can't rule out that they might still find some pretext that would allow them to carry out an intervention in Venezuela. For the sake of protecting the interests of the American nation, anything is possible. The idea is simple. After all, Venezuela is very rich, and as far as we understand, it has practically the largest oil reserves in the world. They're competing with Canada over who has more. It's not as cheap as in Saudi Arabia, but it is well processed in the US. The oil there is heavy. As far as I know, Venezuelan oil isn't very light. But American refineries know how to process it, and that's always been the case. And again, as far as I know, there is already some movement and some shipments of oil from Venezuela to the US are already underway. It's written very carefully there that basically this is only the case if the revenues from these operations do not go to the Venezuelan government. Well, it's actually a pretty funny situation, but for now, that's how things stand. For the US, this would actually be a good scenario. They could quickly ramp up oil production in Venezuela. There was infrastructure which has been destroyed or damaged, But as they say with an American oil company, it's entirely possible to restore it all. Then Venezuelan oil would go to US refineries, and American oil would be exported around the world. So, in other words, this scenario is possible. That's why, of course, we can't rule out the possibility of intervention, so we're watching with interest. If this happens and Venezuela returns to the global oil market, then, of course, well, the rate of decline in global oil prices could accelerate and a very low level could become entrenched. Look, right now the forecasts are that the price will be around $60 per barrel next year. But there are even more alarming forecasts from the International Energy Agency. That's $52 per barrel. For Russia, these are very frightening numbers because the total costs of oil extraction and transportation in Russia, right now, according to various estimates, are somewhere around $40 to $45 for many oil fields. If your price is 52 and that's Brent, not Urals, and there's a discount of 12 or even 14 off Brent, then it turns out that extracting oil costs you more than you get from selling it. In other words, the oil industry will become unprofitable. Many enterprises will be operating at a loss. Many wells will have to be mothballed. This is a serious disaster. This threat is hanging over Russia, and no one knows what to do about it. But it's clear that Russia's prospects in the oil industry weren't very good to begin with, and now by destabilizing its position on the global oil market because of the war, yes, by giving its enemies the opportunity to take over its share of the global market, Russia has driven itself into a huge long-term predicament.
Igor Vladimirovich, how do you assess the prospects of the 20th package of European Union sanctions? Because everyone is already saying that the 20th is being prepared, but many economists say that the 19th hasn't even started working yet. There's a huge shadow fleet and no one is fighting it. There are no tools for how to control these sanctions. I would like to hear your analysis.
Well, what can I say? The only consistently positive thing I see in these packages is that in every case, they confirm Europe's willingness to punish Russia and support Ukraine. That's what's important to me. As for whether they work or not, that's all very complicated. Some things always work out and some things don't. Because with many things, it's not enough just to designate, announce, and establish them. They need to be implemented. And we keep saying that the tools for enforcing sanctions are rather weak and enforcement is poor. In other words, the European bureaucracy can come up with sanctions, but creating a mechanism for oversight that costs money. That means if you impose a sanction, you then have to allocate funds for some kind of oversight service, inspection, or enforcement against violations of these sanctions. So, the European Union wants to punish Russia, but it doesn't want to spend money on enforcing this sanctions regime. That's the problem, you see. That's why so much of it remains just declarative and is circumvented. We understand that as well. So, in general, these sanction packages are already met with a certain level of irony. But again, from the point of view that they are showing Europe's continued willingness to condemn the aggressor and support Ukraine, that's a good thing. But we shouldn't have any illusions that the European Commission knows everything so well or does everything perfectly. For me, what's happening is actually quite a sad story. The Russian assets, I'm talking about the foreign currency reserves that could have been used to finance Ukraine, supposedly amounting to 140 billion, can't be put to use. Not because the EU is unwilling, but because it's astonishingly inflexible, astonishingly unconstructive, unable to resolve anything at all. I proposed my own mechanism for how these funds could be converted to finance Ukraine, and Norway has already proposed its own mechanism, but there is still no decision. This, of course, is extremely surprising and disappointing.
By the way, that's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you in the final part of our conversation. In fact, that's exactly what Fico just made a statement about, if I'm not mistaken. That Russia's war against Ukraine could last several more years if the European Union decides to transfer Russia's frozen assets to Ukraine so that Ukraine would have the economic means to continue fighting against Russia. But this, if, as I understand it, the current stumbling block is in Belgium, right? Because they were planning, the European Commission was planning. Belgium initially agreed, but then it wanted to receive certain guarantees. Igor Vladimirovich, why can't Belgium make a decision at this point? Because, as I understand it, the majority of the frozen Russian assets are located in Belgium.
Well, Belgium is doing this because it's protecting its own interests, and in that sense, I completely support and understand them. And I don't blame Belgium or its prime minister in any way. Because, after all, the money is on their territory, they bear legal responsibility to Russia for these funds. But they're being told to hand it over, and they're not ready because if Russia suddenly proves again that it has the right to this money, then Belgium will have to return these 140 billion out of its own funds. They're saying, we're not okay with that, there are risks. So if there are risks, then these risks need to be addressed. There are different ways to solve this problem. I suggested creating a risk insurance system for this, which is entirely possible. I even explained how to do it. I've talked about this more than once on Ukrainian TV channels, and I mentioned it to Fagin, and I spoke about it on Union in the presence of your representatives from the Ukrainian government. But nothing really came of it. There was no decision made about insuring this loan so that Belgium wouldn't have to worry about having to cover it alone if something happened, and that solution just isn't there. That's why they're constantly telling the European Union, yo, guys, come on, share the responsibility with us, insure these 140, protect us. And the European Union says, no, maybe someday we'll compensate you somehow, but for now, just hand it over as is. Naturally, the Belgians don't want to do that. So as you can see, an interesting twist of fate has arisen. The second option I suggested was to insure it. Now, in Norway, there's an idea to use their national fund, which is worth over $1 trillion, for this purpose. They want to provide a guarantee for these 140 so that Belgium won't be afraid. If, for example, Russia starts demanding the 140 billion, then the Norwegian sovereign fund would compensate Belgium for that money. So, in other words, a reasonable solution exists, but the European Union, the European Commission hasn't really done anything about it so far. They haven't made a decision. They're just forcing Belgium to agree to give it up for nothing. And naturally, Belgium doesn't want to. It's a strange deadlock. In my opinion, it's purely bureaucratic stupidity. I don't see anything else here. There is a solution, and it's not very complicated. But so far, it hasn't been done, even though it could have been. And as for what Slovakia is saying, well, let's ask a question. If we don't give money to Ukraine, is Putin going to immediately stop fighting? He's planning to fight for many years until he achieves the complete destruction of Ukraine. So what are Slovakia and Hungary suggesting then? That Ukraine should be eliminated as a state and then life will be easier for Slovakia. We need to understand what lies behind this decision. So the question here, of course, is it is possible and necessary to help Ukraine with this money.
Iglandia, do you think that in the near future there is really a chance that Ukraine will receive these frozen Russian assets after all?
Well, I don't see any, insurmountable obstacles, if you will. Everything can be resolved. If there's a will in business, we always find 24 ways to get around any obstacle. That's exactly the art of a business consultant from Tusu. A manager's job is to overcome the obstacles that life throws at you, and all of business is made up of problems that arise, and finding ways around those problems is the task of any manager. So, there's really nothing that would fundamentally prevent us from moving forward. Nothing insurmountable exists. It's just, how should I put it, a lack of flexibility and perhaps a lack of qualification among European experts and the European Commission, who either don't understand the problems or simply don't want to solve them. There's also another, as it were, by the way, this is a very unpleasant problem. That is, on the one hand, the European Union clearly wants to help Ukraine in its war with Russia, but on the other hand, it does not want the destruction of Russia. This greatly reduces the effectiveness of all sanction mechanisms, but the European Union doesn't know what it wants, just like in the United States. No one knows whether they want the destruction of Russia, the collapse of the Russian regime, or if they just want to weaken Putin a little so that he stops fighting, but everything else stays the same, because they're afraid of Russia falling apart. And as long as there is no unified position, they keep wavering. Sometimes they act, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they impose punishments, sometimes they don't enforce them. This is the predicament we're living in. That's why, even though sanctions packages are being adopted, Russia still manages to earn some money from oil exports.
Dear audience, please like our tandem, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments, and also let us know where you're watching us from. Top economist Igor Lipsits breaks down the Russian economy and what lies ahead for it. Of course, we're waiting for the fall of the Venezuelan regime. Maybe at our next meeting, we'll discuss whether Maduro is in Moscow or not, and whether he has joined the company of dictators and war criminals. Igor Vladimirovich, thank you. And as always, I hope to see you again soon.
All the best. Take care.